How does a master sergeant become the president of a country? Today we delve into the story of Samuel Kanyon Doe, a military man who seized power in Liberia. Our tale begins in the heart of West Africa, in the small town of Tuzan, Grand Gede County, Liberia. On the 6th of May in the year 1951, a boy named Samuel Kanyon Doe was born. Little did anyone know that this child, born into humble beginnings, would one day shape the course of his country's history. Samuel's journey into the military began in the late 1960s. The armed forces of Liberia, a force that had been the country's backbone since its formation, became the young Doe's home. It was here that he honed his leadership skills and began his ascent through the ranks. His dedication, discipline, and strategic mind didn't go unnoticed. Over the years, Samuel Kanyon Doe rose to the rank of Master Sergeant, a position of respect and authority. But what is it that makes a man, born into obscurity, rise to such heights? Was it ambition? Was it a thirst for power? Or was it a desire to bring about change? The answer lies in the intricate web of history, politics, and personal ambition that saw Doe rise from a simple soldier to the towering figure of authority he became. This Master Sergeant, however, had his sights set on something even bigger. The barracks, the military drills, the uniform, they were all stepping stones to a larger goal. As the 1980s dawned, Doe was preparing to make a move that would not only alter his life, but would send shockwaves through the entire nation of Liberia. Doe's ambitions, however, extended far beyond the barracks. On a seemingly ordinary day, April 12, 1980, Doe and his compatriots would change the course of Liberia's history. In the early hours of that fateful day, the government of President William R. Tolbert Jr., a man who was once a beacon of hope for many Liberians, met an abrupt end. Samuel Kanyon Doe, a master sergeant in the armed forces of Liberia, led a group of soldiers in a coup d'etat, a move as audacious as it was unexpected. The Tolbert administration, according to Doe, was rife with corruption, a cesspool of graft and authoritarianism. The accusations were severe, and they came from a man who was seemingly committed to a different path, a path of transparency and democratic values. But accusations are one thing, and action is another. Doe took the latter, deciding to overthrow the government he believed was failing its people. The coup was swift and decisive. In a short span of time, the government that had once seemed invincible crumbled under the weight of Doe's ambition and the discontent of the soldiers who followed him. The president was overthrown, and his administration was no more. Doe had not just accused Tolbert's government of corruption and authoritarianism, he had dismantled it. In the aftermath of the coup, Doe assumed power as the chairman of the People's Redemption Council. It was a position of immense power and responsibility, a position that made him the de facto leader of Liberia. He was the head of a new government, one that promised change and a better future. He was the man who had overthrown a president, the man who had promised to rid his country of corruption, but promises are easy to make and much harder to keep. As the chairman of the People's Redemption Council, Doe would soon find himself at the helm of a nation in flux, a nation looking to him for leadership and guidance. And so, Doe became the de facto leader of Liberia. In 1985, Doe took his place as the president of Liberia under dubious circumstances. His ascension to power was not without controversy. He organized elections that same year, boldly declaring himself the winner. However, these elections were far from free and fair. They were marred by widespread irregularities and instances of human rights abuses that sparked international outcry. Under Doe's presidency, Liberia saw a range of new economic and social policies. He sought to modernize the economy, attracting foreign investments, and initiating infrastructure projects. Yet these efforts were often overshadowed by rampant corruption that seemed to permeate every level of his administration. The wealth of the nation was squandered, with precious little trickling down to the ordinary citizens who needed it the most. Doe's regime was not only notorious for its economic mismanagement, but also for its blatant disregard for human rights. Political repression was a hallmark of his presidency. Opposition voices were stifled, dissent was crushed, and fear was a constant companion for many Liberians. Journalists, students, activists, anyone who dared to speak against the regime faced severe consequences. The people of Liberia lived under the shadow of a regime that valued power over the welfare of its citizens. Moreover, Dou's presidency was marked by a disturbing trend of ethnic favoritism. He favored his own ethnic group, the Kron, over others, fueling tension and resentment among the various ethnic communities in Liberia. This favoritism sowed the seeds of division, contributing to the country's descent into civil war in the years following his rule. In conclusion, Dou's presidency was a paradox of sorts. It was a time of economic promise, yet it was also a time of deep-rooted corruption. It was a time of supposed democratic governance, yet it was also a time of widespread human rights abuses. It was a time of unity in the face of a common enemy, yet it was also a time of division and mistrust. His presidency was, to say the least, tumultuous. Dou's rule was not without its fair share of challenges. As we delve deeper into Dou's presidency, we encounter a series of tumultuous events that rocked the very foundations of his rule. The first hurdle Dou faced was the rise of armed opposition groups. These groups were a thorn in the side of his regime, often launching violent attacks aimed at destabilizing the government. They were a manifestation of the widespread discontent with Dou's rule, fueled by accusations of corruption, human rights abuses, and political repression. In addition to these armed factions, Dou was also grappling with internal dissent. Many within his own government were unhappy with his leadership, sparking infighting and power struggles that further weakened his hold on power. This internal dissent was a ticking time bomb that threatened to explode at any moment, adding another layer of instability to his already precarious rule. Economic instability was another significant challenge. Under Dou's rule, Liberia's economy took a nosedive. Corruption was rampant. Public funds were mismanaged, and the country's wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. This economic instability fueled the flames of discontent, leading to widespread poverty and increasing the public's frustration with Dou's regime. Dou's challenges were not limited to his domestic affairs. He also had to navigate a complex web of international relations, particularly with neighboring countries. This was exemplified during the First Liberian Civil War, which broke out in the late 80s. The war was a direct challenge to Dou's rule, and it strained his relations with neighboring countries, some of whom were accused of supporting the rebel factions fighting against his government. These multifaceted challenges painted a picture of a regime on the brink of collapse. Dou's rule was marked by instability, tension, and conflict, both within and outside Liberia's borders. His attempts to maintain control amidst these challenges only served to exacerbate the situation, leading to further discontent and unrest. As the pressures mounted, Dou's regime began to crumble. The challenges and conflicts of his rule were the cracks that eventually led to the downfall of Dou's regime. But that's a story for another scene. In 1990, the winds of change blew through Liberia once again. The decade had barely begun when rebel forces, led by the formidable Charles Taylor, launched a major offensive against Dou's government. It was the spark that lit the fuse of the full-scale civil war that would consume the nation. The brutality of the conflict was a stark contrast to the once hopeful vision Dou had promised. Liberia, a nation already wearied by years of corruption and repression, was now being torn apart by war. The echoes of gunfire and the cries of the desperate became the grim soundtrack of everyday life. In the whirlwind of chaos, Dou was captured by rebel forces in September. His fate? A grim echo of his own rise to power. The man who had once led a successful coup was now at the mercy of his captors. His execution marked the fall of his regime, the end of an era. Dou's reign ended not with a whimper but a bang. Dou's presidency left an indelible mark on Liberia. The years under his rule were, unfortunately, marred with authoritarianism, corruption, and human rights abuses. His iron-fisted leadership style stifled democratic processes, and his government's pervasive corruption eroded public trust. His regime's human rights record was dismal, with widespread reports of political repression, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Perhaps even more devastating was the impact of his regime's collapse and the subsequent civil war. The power vacuum left by Dou's downfall plunged Liberia into years of instability, violence, and humanitarian crises. The nation bled and suffered, its people bearing the brunt of the chaos. But the legacy of Samuel Kanyon Dou is not just about the negative consequences of his rule. It's a complex narrative that challenges us to reflect on the perils of power obtained and wielded without checks and balances. Samuel Kanyon Dou's story is a stark reminder of the perils of power obtained and wielded without checks and balances.